Welcome, everyone. I am here with Christopher Satoor, the young idealist. Hopefully, by the end of this conversation, we will have completed the system of German idealism. Before we get going, Chris, thank you for being here. Could you tell everyone a little bit about yourself, how you got into philosophy, just your general background?
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank you for inviting me here. I'm a big fan of your podcast. I saw an episode with one of my friends, Daniel Tutt, on your show, and after that, I began watching many of your other episodes, and I kind of got hooked. And then you invited me on here, so I'm very honored to be here.
Thanks. Yeah,
Um,
did you see the one I did recently on Daniel's channel?
yes, I also saw that one as well too. I think that was the with video, right?
Yes, yeah, and I was glad to do that. It was sort of hash out our differing interpretations because normally on my show, I'm more about learning the other person's perspective. It was nice to have not an adversarial conversation, but a conversation where there was actually some pushback and disagreement. And Daniel was a great guy to do it with because we were able to do it very respectfully and very collegially. I don't know if that's a correct term, but yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Actually, it's funny because Schellingians and Nietzscheans, we have this connection because of Lukács has famously put both Nietzsche and Schelling in the irrational camp. So I was also on Dan's show to defend Schelling against both Lukács and Engels kind of really, to me, it's a bad, uncharitable reading of Schelling. So I went on and it was very, as you say, collegially. It was a very honest and charitable discussion where we discussed the ideas, and that's one thing I really like about him. But to get to my story, I was never really interested in academia or academics. Didn't know what philosophy was, probably into my early 20s. And then I somehow ended up at like a trade school, like a college, where I ended up taking general arts and applied sciences. And there I met interestingly enough, I met a retired Kantian scholar named Brian Nakata, who got me really interested in Kant in the most odd way. I was attending one of the lectures on Was ist Aufklärung? What is enlightenment? And that first opening line, dare to know, have the courage to use your own reason. I just thought that was just so annoying. Like, okay, boomer, what? What do you mean, what is enlightenment? Like, what do you mean, dare to know? It really upset me. And then that made me realize that a lot of us at that early age kind of go along with what everyone else is doing. And it was Kant that really got me into philosophy. I became kind of obsessed with Kant and decided that after the college degree, I wanted to do an undergraduate in philosophy and went to York University where I took all my classes in continental philosophy. I did a lot of analytic as well too, but mainly I was interested in Kant and Fichte and Hegel and of course Nietzsche and Heidegger and many others. And I just came obsessed with philosophy so much. And then went on into grad school. I moved away from German idealism for a bit, um, engaged in the thought of like Gilles Deleuze and did a master's on Deleuze actually, and wrote it on difference and repetition, which is still, I still appreciate that text. But it was when I started my first year of my PhD, I took this class called Essays on the Philosophy of Freedom, where we return to Kant's Critique of Judgment, Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, or The Doctrine of Science, and read Schelling's Freedom Essay, and I was blown away. And that was it. It was around 2014, 2015, and that was it. I was hooked. It
Could you
was like a,
briefly just say what was it that hooked you about Schelling's freedom essay?
as a recovering Deleuzian, I loved Spinoza, but Schelling was really critiquing Spinoza. He was finding fault at Spinoza's monism, or what Schelling calls its one-sided realism. He relates it to a Pygmalion statue, like an old Greek statue frozen, with no dynamic colors or no facial expression, no life. The word life is brought up in the freedom essay like 51 times. And what he felt was that Spinoza gives us this wonderful, rich, system, and yet there's something missing. That element of life is missing. But the freedom essay also has this mystical, theosophical element to it, because Schelling and his friend Franz von Botter studied people like Friedrich Christoph Erninger, and of course, one of my own loves, Jakob Böhme, who inspires Schelling to take philosophical concepts and read them through a theosophical lens in order to kind of tell the story of creation. I was blown away that we could philosophize like this. I was kind of shocked that we could talk about the beginning of all beginnings that no one's experienced before. This uncognized matter, this uncognized content. How can we talk about a beginning that we've never experienced? And here's Schelling talking about this dark, unfurling ground. And later on, Schelling moves away from concepts like subject and object to what he calls personhood or personality. And for me, it was huge because this is a German idealist talking about ontology. And for me, this text, the Freedom Essay at least, is where Schelling says goodbye to idealism. He states in it that idealism is the soul of philosophy, realism is its body, and only the two together can form an organic whole. So, an idealist realism, so an ontology here. I've continued to read this text, and I think a lot of Schellingians, even Schelling scholars, were always when we read this text, we're so blown away by it. We learn something new every time we read it. It's a short text, it's 77 pages, and there's so much packed in it.
So are you saying that to the extent that Spinoza, his monism, it's not living, is a large part of that because it doesn't have a force of darkness or evil involved in it, which is a positive force for Schelling?
Yes, so here's that's a really great question, actually. First and foremost, Schelling has a problem with it. One of the biggest problems with Spinoza is because of what's called the pantheism controversy, which starts because a brilliant relationship between Gotthold Lessing and Moses Mendelssohn. It's kind of it's almost a miracle. At the time in Prussia, Jews were not allowed citizenship, German citizenship, and Moses Mendelssohn got it. And he had this really great friendship with Lessing. And it was almost, a Christian and a Jew coming together. It's unbelievable. But then
Yeah,
here
I
comes,
think Will Durant hypothesizes he might be sort of the inspiration for Nathan the Wise, the subject of Lessing's play.
yes, no, 100%. I agree 100% with that. The problem here is that Jacobi gets involved. So this philosopher named Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi gets involved and releases this dialogue where he states that Lessing was not a Christian, that Lessing was not an enlightened Christian, sorry, a rationalist Christian, but a pantheist. And this threw off everybody because now it throws that dynamic between the Christian and the Jew out the window because here we go. Lessing's an atheist, he's a pantheist, and Jacobi then takes this trait of pantheism and basically creates this hasty generalization that all metaphysics, that all philosophical speculative philosophy is basically Spinozaism. And so when Schelling is really, really young, he writes a letter to Hegel saying he has found a new teacher, and that's Spinoza. So, early Schelling's work, he has, I would say, three main sources. He's got, Kant's Critique of Judgment, he's got Spinoza and Plato. But what he does with Spinoza is he's obsessed with Spinoza for such a long time. But when he gets to the Freedom Essay, he needs to distinguish between this dynamic pantheism that he has in mind and what he calls Spinoza's fatalism. And he thinks that Spinoza is a fatalist and a determinist because there's no concept of the will. There's no free will in Spinoza. There's no concept of this dynamic will. Schelling will call it a primordial will. And it's got predicates like eternality, groundlessness, all of these wonderful, rich predicates that he'll, kind of undress in the freedom essay. And his problem with Spinoza is that all things in God, right? Deo sive natura, God or nature, according to Spinoza, everything in it is modes. Everything in it is just things. And Schelling has such a problem with that. No, they're not just things. They can't be things. They have their own freedom, their own spirit, their own will. And that's the thing that he has the biggest problem with, as well as what you said very, very nicely before, this concept of evil. Evil can't just be us in a stoic sense, thinking that, we can overcome solutions by just thinking, overcoming it in a stoic sense by what Spinoza will say is that evil is sad passions, and we have to overcome that with joy. And Schelling thinks it's just no, that's not the case. There is something about evil. There is a root of it in the ground of nature. At the very, very beginning, this primordial dark ground has this surging ego, this yearning to make everything its own. And he says that this is the kind of root of evil. It's already in everything.
That's influential on Schopenhauer, correct?
100%. It's funny. Schopenhauer will say, I think in volume two of the world as will and representation, sorry. He'll say things like that Schelling is a great influence on him, but so is Jakob Boehme. And he thinks that Schelling just kind of plagiarized everything from Boehme, which I don't think that's correct. But yes, no. I would say that Schopenhauer is immensely influenced by Schelling and that conception of the will. It really is Schelling that in the Freedom Essay, which is, by the way, his last publication, that it's central for him. The will is this central, energizing dynamic in being, actually.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier Schelling writing to Hegel, Schopenhauer's arch nemesis. I wanted to take a moment to talk about the fact that they were school friends at the Tübingen Seminary, and along with Hölderlin. And I'm very interested in friendships like that. These, just like you were mentioning with, say, Lessing and Jacobi, and the effect that that has. I think of like Goethe meeting Herder. And Herder, of course, has his own interpretation of Spinoza that's more charitable to his pantheism, that I think greatly influences Goethe's reading of Spinoza. Yeah, could we talk about that a little bit, about this trio at Tübingen, and is their friendship significant for understanding their careers? And how does Hellenism, which was really popular in Germany at the time, play into sort of their upbringing?
Absolutely. No, this is a really important question, actually. So Schelling, let me just give you a little small intro bio on him and why it's important. So Schelling was really what we say in German, a Wunderkind. He spoke six languages. He spent his free time in his father's library reading Thucydides to Homer to Plato. He was quite young, really young, when he went to Latin school in Nürtingen, and the teacher sent him home with a note to his father saying, I can't teach this young man anything else. So when he goes to the seminary, he's 5 years younger than both Hölderlin and Hegel. And Schelling's father, Joseph Schelling, who's close with the Hölderlin family, asks Hölderlin to be a chaperone for the young Schelling. And already Hölderlin is friends with Hegel, so the three of them get together. But they find they are all kind of wound up by the fervor of the French Revolution. Schelling translates the Marseillaise, the French national anthem, into German and is almost suspended from the seminary.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no. They plant a freedom tree somewhere outside their boarding room, and they dance around it, singing Hen Kai Pan, one and all, one and all. So they also, in 1797, they write the oldest systematic program of German idealism, which is extremely influenced by, I would say, Platonism. And they call for a new mythology. They call for a new religion. They call for a state, like what Plato calls in the Commune, like a stateless community that's not like a mechanism. But let me just back up for a second. While at Tübingen, Schelling immersed himself in the Neoplatonic literature, and he engaged in a really deep study of Plato, particularly with interest in an attention to the divine and knowledge. And so he studied the Ion, the Theaetetus, the Meno, and he spent a large time focusing on the metaphysics of the Philebus and the Timaeus. And the Timaeus is going to be a huge, huge dialogue for him because in the freedom essay, he'll say, when he's talking about the beginning of the cosmos, he describes the beginning of the cosmos, this receptacle, as this wave-wound whirling sea akin to Plato's matter. So we get this kind of
Mm.
chorology in the background of the freedom essay and in his unfinished Ages of the World. So he has this kind of Timaean demiurgos that's ensouling the cosmos and the heavenly bodies, but the demiurgos would be God the Father. He has a kind of Christianized Timaeus. But what makes Schelling so akin to Plato, it's because as he's working through his own understanding, he considers the absolute, the one, to be conceptually inaccessible. It transcends conceptual thought. We can only grasp it by intimating with analogical formations, so things like works of art or nature as a whole. And the system of transcendental idealism, which is Schelling publishes in the 1800s, or 1800, sorry. Schelling says, what binds mind and nature is art. So art becomes the organ for philosophy because what happens is that nature's unconscious powers affects us. Now, what does that mean? That means kind of like this. You see a beautiful image in nature, or words come to you after an experience. And that influence, that genius is nature making its mark on you. And this is mainly unconscious. So this kind of non-discursive communication that Schelling talks about, that becomes kind of like absolute cognition or reason or genius or somehow grasped through intellectual intuition, all of these terms, is directly linked to his study of Platonism. Now, with Hölderlin, after in 1797, Hölderlin's best grasp of his Platonism, of his influence of Plato at the time, right? He writes this beautiful work called The Hyperion, or The Hermit of Greece, and it's published in 1797 when he's really young, and so is Schelling at the time. The Hyperion takes place as a series of letters, a description of this man, Hyperion, whose letters we're reading, we the reader are reading. And as he gazes out on the Ionian Sea from the great heights of the Corinthian Isthmus, he's overwhelmed by the beauty of his immediate surroundings. But his mind is never at ease, and we sense this inner conflict with the Hyperion. He feels this conflict about his homeland. And Hyperion, the individual, this hermit of Greece, is a modern Greek whose own life journey is brought about by this debilitating state of homesickness. And he's homesick because of modernity, the modern world, or let's say the enlightened world, where reason, rationality, and mechanization has taken over everything. And so in his isolation, he is not longing for Greek antiquity like most bad interpretations of Romanticism, but he loses himself in his own reflection, in his own contemplation, which he sees this role of grasping the one or the unity of the one from people like Plotinus and of course Plato, and where he experiences the real beauty of nature. And it makes himself be at one with the world. He realizes that this step back, this Schritt zurück, And this ability to see nature and mind, or life and divinity, in this mode of reflection or contemplation, that all tensions kind of dissolve. So that's Hölderlin's great kind of grasp of the kind of Hellenization and of Plato at the time. This is he of course publishes this after the Tübingen Stift, but it's really interesting that, at the time in 1797, Schelling is also publishing Platonic treatises that are, influenced by Plato, but concepts of nature. Like in 1797, Schelling releases Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature, where just like Hölderlin, he's trying to grasp this bridge between mind and nature, right? He'll say things like, nature is invisible spirit, spirit is invisible nature. So he has this, it's a very
Mm.
famous line where we don't see the forces and intensities in nature, and yet nature does have its own kind of freedom, its own spirit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was thinking when you were speaking about his influence from Plato, the way that, not necessarily to bring it back to Schopenhauer again, but the fact that Kant and Plato were so the two main influences for Schopenhauer, and he sees a kind of unity between them, even though there are important differences, he tries to sort of synthesize them. And I was thinking as you were talking about the one, the absolute, which we cannot cognize, there seems to be an analogy to the noumenon. But unlike Kant, if I'm understanding you correctly, Schelling has this conception that art can be the bridge. Would you say that we could describe it in Kantian terms as bridging the phenomenal world, which is patterned by the mind, and somehow having an experience or an inkling of the noumenon as the absolute?
This is a really important question. Schelling writes a letter to Hegel where he says that there are missing premises in Kant's philosophy. And this is why I think like Schopenhauer sees Fichte and Hegel and Schelling as a reversion to Kant. So I think you're right about this, but I think that Schelling's bridge with art and even the plastic arts as well too. So pottery, I forget how it's called. I think the creations of statue or stature for him is in a sense freedom. It's the freedom of joining the two worlds together. Like Schelling will state that every human being in the Ideas treatise starts off in this mode of spiritual sickness. We start off with this kind of Cartesian mode of reflection where we contract into ourselves, where everything is kind of dominated by ourselves. And he thinks that we are trained in that sense. We're trained to be those Cartesian thinkers. And yet, what needs to happen is this bridge with nature. So, yes, so in 1800, he begins saying that art is this organ for philosophy, and that the act of genius, this act of this unconscious power, enacting on us is something that helps us experience the world, experience the unity of the world. I'm not sure
That
I answered your question.
No, well, what it reminds me of is Nietzsche's lectures on the pre-Platonic philosophers, some of which is partially reproduced. It's in Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks. A lot of that seems to be based on those lectures, although that essay went unfinished. When Nietzsche's trying to describe the philosopher, he's trying to describe who the philosopher is. And he has this really interesting approach of saying their question is not how philosophy developed, but how the type of the philosopher developed. So, what type of person would begin to philosophize before there are any institutions or an art practiced called philosophy? So, he's trying to describe what the philosopher is doing. And even as early as Thales, he says that there is an artistic element, that we can imagine somebody like Thales standing, at a brook where there might be a little waterfall and watching the particles of water sort of dance and seeing various shapes in them and coming to this sort of artistic conclusion that all is water. He says it both overleaps the sciences and takes us in one fell swoop into metaphysics while at the same time being fundamentally an artistic and perspectival act, in that the philosopher, the way he puts it, lets the total chord of the universe chime out of himself. That in a way he's showing us the world in his own mirror. But what are all the pre-Socratics, or as Nietzsche calls them, pre-Platonics, trying to do? They're trying to name the arche. They're trying to show what the unity of things is. What is it that in this enduring unity, either a substantial unity or some sort of, in the case of Heraclitus, I would argue, more like a process unity or a functional unity. I'm not exactly sure how I would put it, but it's interesting because Nietzsche seemed to have a similar attitude that he would later develop in his philosophical career. The valuation being the evaluative judgment and taste and impulse and drive and perspective being part of the truth claim, part of the image of truth, that there is something like art that is at the bleeding edge of philosophizing. And so, yeah, I'd be interested in your reaction to that. And also, we mentioned a bit before we started recording that Nietzsche may have been influenced by, or you said there's increasing evidence he was influenced by some of Schelling's lectures. And so maybe we could get into that as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What I was thinking about as you had a really, really nice, you described that very nicely, actually. I could see it in my head, actually. Schelling's, I would say his kind of mature philosophy, so his philosophy of nature in 1799, he talks about nature, and this relates to the philosopher as well too. Nature is this, or even the cosmos, the world is this unconditioned, absolute mode of productivity. This is why I love talking about Schelling so much. And he relates this absolute mode of productivity as a flowing stream, which goes right back to your remark about Nietzsche
Mm.
and that really nice example with water. But he says this living stream, this infinite living stream, meets resistance as it curves and bends and winds. And when it meets resistance, this is the influence of Fichte, the anstos, the check, little tiny whirlpools form. And those individuated whirlpools are what Schelling will call actants. And so what are human beings? What is art? What is philosophy? But actants, we're like rogue monads
Oh, wow.
acting
Okay.
on one another. So maybe there's a lot of overlap, I think, between Nietzsche and Schelling. But there is some evidence that Nietzsche did read Schelling's late lectures on mythology, especially because Schelling, sorry, spends so much time on the relationship between Dionysus and Apollo. Now, these lectures weren't published, but because at the time in 31, when Hegel dies, the chair of Berlin philosophy is empty, and the King of Prussia needed it to be filled at the time. Many of Hegel's students the king feared them. They were quite radical. They were radical in the sense of politics, the young Hegelians. And he asked Schelling to come and take the chair. And Schelling lectured, and it was a huge event. I mean, people like Engels, Burckhardt, Kierkegaard, Bakunin, so many people came to these lectures on the positive philosophy and the mythology from 41 to 42. There are reports that it was elbow to elbow. People were fighting for places to sit, and there's Schelling, in the back of the room, just covered in a swamp, a sea of people. So these lectures were many people would pay like working scribes to write them all down, what he was saying verbatim, and they got passed on from people to people to people. So much so that William James received copies of
Oh,
these
wow.
lectures in America. They got sent all the way over everywhere. Schelling was very frustrated with this, that people were publishing them, people were sending them out everywhere. He had a lawsuit against somebody, a theologian who named Paulus, that published them without his recognition. He lost the case, believe it or not. But yes, so there is some evidence. I'll have to find you some of the articles later. They're on the tip of my tongue right now.
Yeah, I
That
can put them in the description for everyone to look at.
Yeah, that Nietzsche did in fact read these lectures on mythology and did in fact was inspired by Schelling's writings on mythical relation. of Dionysus and Apollo. Even someone like the great neo-Kantian Ernst Cassirer brings up this point that all philosophy is related to mythology when it begins with arche or beginning, and there's this indifference point between a principle or arche and understanding the beginning of the cosmos. And this is where the role of metaphysics comes in. And I think Schelling has this. Not that I'm saying that Nietzsche is a philosopher of mythology, but I think what Nietzsche does very nicely in that wonderful text on tragedy is just he's doing the same thing. He's talking about the human condition and the way that Schelling is talking about the human condition. These representations of these gods represent these forces, dark and light, or evil or good, etc. But yeah, so there seems to be like a lot of overlap between the two of them.
I was thinking as you were recounting all the people who came to his lectures, if Jakob Burckhardt was there, then Nietzsche might have even discovered those lectures through him because they were somewhat close at Basel. It's funny you bring up Cassirer because I've been working on an episode on Cassirer. He's probably one of my favorite early 20th century philosophers, actually, and I think criminally underrated. I've noticed quite a few parallels between his work and Nietzsche's, particularly Nietzsche's early essay on truth and lies in the non-moral sense, where there's a similar attempt to understand language as a sort of in a very similar way that Cassirer understands language, as a sort of spontaneous eruption of emotion is what the signifier originally is, and then it's sort of as it becomes we might imagine the imagery of like becoming cooled and hardened like magma or something like that. Then it can become a sort of an exchangeable, it can come to stand for an idea and not just a momentary expression, and then becomes exchangeable in some way. I would say Cassirer definitely incorporates a great deal from German idealism, and so that's like another influence in that direction on Nietzsche as well. You mentioned the forces. Maybe this would be a good time to talk about Schelling's take on the dialectic of potencies, because it strikes me that it's very similar to Nietzsche's understanding of forces. Also, when you were talking earlier about the river and the whirlpools, right? That very much called to mind for me Nietzsche's fascination with the physicist and philosopher of science, Roger Boscovich, who has this idea of force points as the particles of the universe rather than atoms, which are stuff or substance. Boscovich thinks essentially the underlying reality is force, and it's one type of wave, I guess, or he has like a single equation that, depending on the speed and the distance at which it acts, would manifest all the different forces that account for everything going on in physics. I have to admit I don't have a physicist's understanding of Boscovich, and it's kind of antiquated stuff anyway. It's very hard to find guides to reading Boscovich, but Nietzsche was very much taken with Boscovich because Nietzsche has this sort of struggle with the atomists, right? That he thinks it's the residuum of Parmenides, this desire to hold on to some sort of being, when Nietzsche's, more Heraclitean, and he wants to see things in terms of becoming, in terms of processes rather than things. Could we maybe, in light of that, sort of compare Schelling's understanding of forces and potencies and how it compares with Nietzsche?
Absolutely. And actually, I wanted to say just one thing before that. It's really interesting. Schelling in 1796 visited his brother in Leipzig. His brother Karl was a physician, was a doctor, and Schelling had a love of medicine. Picked up a really strange kind of English doctor, practitioner named John Brown, who was at the time flirting with the concepts of contraction and expansion. And these two forces, contraction and expansion, will be read through all of Schelling's philosophy. So it's interesting that, Nietzsche has this one physicist that he finds that interests him and talks about certain things that this physicist brings into his thought or whatever. But Schelling is the same thing. He becomes extremely interested in, I would say, the science at the time, as well as medicine. And he begins reading up on magnetism and electricity and chemistry. And so he's very interested in how the sciences work and how the sciences have their own living worlds. Let's just say that. But what he does say is that these potencies, Schelling first introduces them as what he calls a Stufenfolge, so an ascending ladder. And it's funny, Hegel in 1801, I would say, in the Difference essay, is a Schellingian. Hegel is the one that dibs Schelling as a what he calls an objective idealist, as opposed to a subjective idealist like Fichte. But in this early phase, Schelling sees matter or living, the entire cosmos kind of unfolding in this sense. So the first potency is what he will, a kind of swirling nebula of let's say liquids, or not liquids, but gases coming together. I think of it like a nebula. And this is the first kind of potency. It's this kind of primal matter, very Platonic here as well, too. We can say this. The second potency is how these solidify and become either into processes like magnetism, electricity as well. And the third potency, which is the last state, is living forms. So we have this first Genesis state of potency, where we have, let's just say, a soup of things. The second potency is their coming together, their forming, their individuation. We can talk about those whirlpools again, if you'd like. And then finally, the third potency is nature becoming conscious through human beings and all matter. And Schelling, like Plato, has a kind of hierarchy, a hierarchy of consciousness, let's say, but it's not that we are more conscious than any other animal. We just have a higher degree in this third potency, this third power of developing. Lovejoy brings this up in his text, The Great Chain of Being. He actually ends the text with Schelling. But these potencies play out through all of his philosophy. So that's just the nature philosophy. So in the nature philosophy, we have these three potencies in 1799, first outline for a system of the philosophy of nature. The first potency always represents this Genesis mode, this mode of where everything, even inanimate matter, is in a sense like a whirling sea that then comes in, and there's this, again, contractive and expansive motion, a mode of resistance and a mode of coming together where one force takes over the other becomes ground, and the other becomes almost subordinate to it. And this system of drives, this wheel of drives in the first potency then leads to the second potency, which is literally, as I said, the coming together of forces, the coming together of chemicals. And Schelling brings up in earlier texts on things like he goes into detail about magnetic forces, talks about electricity and chemicals coming together. I'm not a scientist, so I wish I could give better details about this. But the third point is that human beings are the final kind of telos of nature. We're the kind of final purpose of nature, nature becoming conscious through us. In later works, the potencies will always be, the potencies start off as a foundation, and then from that foundation, they kind of reach out of themselves. So the potencies represent what is just blind, brute necessity, but then necessity becomes ensouled, or necessity needs to mirror itself. So it mirrors itself in one way in order to, it mirrors itself or creates a complete replica of it, an object of itself. You can see some Hegelianness in this here. And what happens is it then needs more. It wants more. And so we get this dynamic between freedom and necessity. And this is what Schelling will always say. The potencies will always lead to, at first, necessity, beginning of necessity. Necessity then witnessing or experiencing or wanting to reach, stretch out. Sometimes the language Schelling uses is that, for freedom. And then finally, the unity between those. But the unity isn't just like, sometimes I say it's like this, like we have a coin that represents the whole, heads and tails. Heads is individuated and different from tails, but tails itself, tails is also individuated and different, and the two of them make up the whole. They're part of that whole. This goes back to that kind of hen kai pan, the one and the all that we were talking about earlier. So he has this relationship, and as he matures, the potencies become more and more, we can say they get personified. They become much more related to drive. So in the ages of the world, the first potency begins as a contractive will, a will that wills nothing. You can think of life that wants to maintain itself as sheer infinity. It doesn't want anything else but itself. It wants to continuously contract on itself, becoming this will that wills nothing. But there is something in it, something within it that then becomes wants more. This is that element of freedom. It wants to will something. And then what happens is that they split. There's a splitting between the two of them. Schelling believes, unlike Hegel, that contradictions need to be upheld. There is no sublation for Schelling. Schelling does not appreciate that mode of sublation where everything comes together. There's always a unity, but the unity is disjunctive.
Mm,
It
okay.
maintains this. Am I going
Is
too far
no,
here?
no, 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 no. That makes sense to me. Is it that the disjunction of the unity is the thing that's productive?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely, 100%. The disjunct of the unity is what makes it productive, 100%. And this is what sets him differently, or this was what differentiates him, sorry, from Hegel. Now, Hegel was also deeply influenced by Goethe. So, that wonderful beginning of the phenomenology of spirit where he's talking about the plant, right? He's talking about first it starts
Right.
as a stem and then a plant and then the plant grows into a fruit. So he has a similar mode of understanding, but Schelling would say that all of these points need to be upheld. They need all of these specific points within the production. Like I think Schelling in his most early stages, is like a proto-process philosopher. He sees creativity and the dynamism within each mode, and contradiction needs to maintain a resistance. It needs to uphold these phases. So the will that wills nothing, then the will that wills something. And then oddly, when the will is creative and dynamic, the ground of that is that contractive will. So we have these two wills that are these two principles within this disjunctive element of it. Sorry if that was completely all over the place.
No, I think I get it. That was actually going to be a subsequent question was sort of like what did Hegel think of Schelling like later in their careers? But that makes sense that he's taking this Goethean like Urphenomenon of the Urpflanze being the most famous example, which is the unity of the phenomenon essentially that Goethe
Yep.
thinks we can directly apprehend the thing as a unity, and looking at Hegel's dialectic through that lens, it does contrast with Schelling. But I mean, what would you say then? I'm sure that this is not the case, but are there some Hegelians who will dismiss Schelling as like a dualist?
He has gotten that. So Schelling gets oddly classified as a dualist, and sometimes he gets classified as someone that doesn't understand difference. So the main assault on Schelling was by Hegel, who in the introduction of the phenomenology says that understanding Schelling's conceptions of like intellectual intuition or even the absolute is the night where all cows turn black, because he thinks that that everything becomes homogenized. Everything is just homogenized completely. And Schelling's really not saying that. He's kind of saying that if we take the cosmos as a body of water, that everything in what unifies that body of water is what Schelling calls absolute identity. Now, identity, let's say, let's call it H2O. It's the waterness, or it's the water. It's the element
The
of,
the substance of it, or
yes, the
yeah,
essence of it. But where phenomena appears is on the surface of the water, like the ripples.
right.
right? And the ripples are able to interact with other ripples and waves and etc. But
I
what
guess
Hegel,
what
yep, go.
the
No, go
dualistic
on.
element I
Sorry.
was kind of picking up on, though, it's funny because it reminds me of Empedocles, who obviously was the subject of one of Hölderlin's his most famous unfinished play, or I guess he does like three versions of it, and I don't think he ever has like his a version that he finds satisfactory before he loses his mind. But Empedocles, his philosophy is based on attraction and repulsion, which is not exactly the same thing as contraction and expansion, but it's this idea that there are these two elements that are always at work and that one never really overcomes the other. Ultimately, I think in Empedocles' philosophy, he does have a unifying idea of love, which he calls Aphrodite or Harmonia, but there's this idea that there's forever this interplay of attraction and repulsion. Like he's sort of imagining, the four elements and their various different rarefactions and versions of them sort of coming together to make all of the things that are composites of them and then breaking apart sort of as a life, so it is very similar in that way, but it reminded me of that, where you could read Empedocles either way, as sort of like a monist or a dualist, and I guess that's usually what we find with people who have a dialectical philosophy, right? I was wondering maybe what the Hegelian response is to that, because it seems that with Hegel, you just sort of have this like negative movement of the concept of mind. Would you agree with that conception that there seem to be these two forces in Schelling versus Hegel seems to be able to account for it just through the absolute mind revealing itself to itself or something like that.
Right, like the movement of it. And it's funny, in the freedom essay, you get the same thing. You get the dual principles of ground, which becomes the real, and existence, which is the ideal. And yet absolute identity is unified in what Schelling will later bring up through Jakob Böhme's conception of the non-ground, the Ungrund. And we find out that absolute identity reconciles ground and existence in this mode of indifference. So Schelling has this concept of absolute indifference that allows for differences to emerge disjunctively, which we were talking about a little earlier. But the non-ground is what precedes all grounds, and it's predicateless. So Hegel loved the freedom essay. He said it was a speculative essay. He thought it was interesting, but that Schelling has no system to stand on, and that it would be good if he could turn the freedom essay into a system of sorts.
Yeah,
And
Hegel would say that, wouldn't he?
yeah, no. And so he was really unhappy. So Schelling always has this third element that represents what he calls the indifference punct, the indifference point. And it is this third element that binds all unities. It's the unifying mechanism. When we get to this point, it's always at the end of every treatise. So in the ages of the world, the Ungrund is then called the Godhead or divinity or lucid purity. And it is this, and this is the odd point about it. At the end of the freedom essay, he says, this is the highest point of the essay, this mode of indifference, this absolute indifference allows for these differences to emerge, allows for difference. So without indifference, you can think of this in a Derridean sense. Indifference, we wouldn't have difference. So he expresses it in this sense. Now, the later Schelling will state something that Hegel, and how you stated it before, has collapsed the real into the ideal, the absolute concept, the movement towards this absolute concept or absolute idea has destroyed the unity between the ideal, so ideas, and the real, nature. They are collapsed into one. And so it's odd, it's funny that Schelling gives this critique, and the minute that he gives this critique, he says, "Okay, okay, Hegel, you won. You have completed the system of German idealism. You win, but that system is negative.
Right.
All determinations are negations. Hegel gets this from Spinoza. Omnia est I think omnia determinatio est negatio. All determinations are negations. And Schelling says, no, all determinations are actualizations. This is maybe where Schelling and Nietzsche the kind of life-affirming element of the two of them are much more connected than maybe the earlier kind of idealist Schelling. Schelling will say, no, we now need to move away from essences and move closer to what we call thatness, facticity. We need to move towards the thatness of reality. Why is there something rather than nothing? This is a point that really, really irks me because a lot of Heideggerians say, oh, no, this is from Heidegger. No, that's not true. This
Hmm.
is an original Leibnizian question that Schelling takes up. Why is there a world rather than no world at all? Why is there reason rather than unreason? And this becomes his trend. This becomes his new philosophical method, this positive philosophy, this philosophy of existence, where he thinks that his own philosophy of idealism could only grasp the essence of things grounded in concepts. That's it. And that really, moving forward, we need to start off with being, a philosophy of being. And it's through studying Hegel's logic he realizes the kind of maybe the error of his ways. But for Schelling, he'll say, no, but you need idealism, you need the negative philosophy to a certain point in order for the philosopher to then move towards positive philosophy.
That's interesting. When you were speaking earlier about his invocation of calling it the Godhead, maybe that's a good pivot into the mysticism of Schelling. Thinking about the groundless ground of being, that really fired a lot of neurons for me because I have a background in Buddhism. That's often the language that many of the sutras talk about being in a way. The groundlessness of it, the emptiness of the Buddha nature and things like this. But even if we go to Christianity in the West, right, like Meister Eckhart, the inaccessible God, I'm very fascinated by Christian mysticism. And so I'm wondering, how does that tie into Schelling's philosophy? Does that play a role in how he intends to move forward with an affirmative philosophy?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me begin by saying that Schelling grew up in a very religious family. And it's interesting, just to go back to our last question, what's the differences between Hegel and Schelling? Well, Manfred Frank, who's a really brilliant German philosopher, makes this great point where he says that Hegel's father, was a politician. And it's so interesting that later in life, Hegel becomes so interested in the philosophy of right and politics and society. And Schelling's father was a pastor and a scholar. And it's so interesting that his late philosophy, or his whole, let's just say from one point, he's so kind of obsessed with religion and the philosophy of religion and philosophical religion. So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, the two of them and maybe how they're different. But growing up, Schelling grew up in a very Lutheran family, but a family that was so entrenched in what's called pietism. Kant was also a pietist, but Schelling's pietism that he grew up with was grounded in, let's say, the theosopher and mystical thinker Jakob Boehme. Now, Boehme is a really important character and thinker for Schelling because Boehme was, let's say, a brilliant autodidact who never studied Latin or Greek, was self-taught, was a cobbler, and was having great discussions with with alchemists and let's say Paracelsians and all of this great language. And Schelling grows up in the kind of Lutheran tradition, pietism, which is basically alchemy, Paracelsianism, Kabbalah, so Christian Kabbalah, all embraced into one. And we know from Gershom Scholem that this is the tradition of Theosophy. So Schelling is extremely interested in Theosophy, so much so that he spends a great portion of his time reading a theologian named Friedrich Christoph Oerdinger. And Oerdinger is so important. Like when it comes to German idealism, Sean McGraw says this, and I agree with him, a brilliant Canadian philosopher, that the missing link in German idealism, from rationalism and empiricism to German idealism, is pietism, is theosophy, this great tradition that embraces people that you've already mentioned, Albert Magnus, Paracelsus, Meister Eckhart, Angelus Silesius. Of course, Jakob Böhme is in there as well. All of this tradition, this Lutheran tradition.
Is this
It's interesting.
Is Swedenborg part of this as well?
Swedenborg is 100% a part
Okay.
of this as well. It's interesting, though, that Eckhart and Cusanus are the only Catholics in the mix, though. But the important thing about Eckhart and Böhme and all of these is that they're using the German vernacular. They're using the German language. Even Eckhart comes up with the term, Grund, ground, releasement, right? This we release ourselves, we empty ourselves for the Spirit of God to move through us. And from ground, we get to non-ground in Jakob Böhme. So this tradition is already there when Schelling is a very young man. After 1804, when he moves to Würzburg, he comes across a good friend of his named Franz von Baader, and it's really sad that most people don't know who Franz von Baader is anymore. He's a theosopher and Catholic philosopher that spent his entire life building a bridge between philosophy and this Latin and Lutheran tradition. So joining them together. So from Plato and Proclus and Plotinus, Neoplatonism, all the way up to Pietism. And he felt that there was something there that was missing. Philosophy has this great capacity to forget its origins and just always look at the present. And Botter was a huge influence on Schelling, so much so that they became obsessed with the spirit world. Schelling had seances with Botter.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
I guess
Um,
that was sort of a general cultural trend at the time as well, where that kind of thing was kind of becoming, I wouldn't say more normal, but intellectuals were dabbling in that more than they would have in, say, the early modern period by the time of the
abs
17th and 18th
I
century.
mean, absolutely. Karl Eschmeyer was talking to a seeress, a provost, about the afterworld. Hegel and Schelling were talking about animal magnetism and mesmerism. I mean, this is all out there. And a lot of Hegelians forget that element of Hegel. That Hegel was really enriched in this tradition as well. Hegel called Meister Eckhart and Jakob Böhme Germany's true German philosophers. They're absolutely huge for Schelling. He realizes that this mystical tradition, this theosophical tradition, allows him to take philosophical concepts and make them much more richer, spiritualize them, ensoul them, let's say. And this is a key element from Schelling's 1804 work, Philosophy and Religion, to the Freedom Essay, to the Ages of the World, to the late Schelling's work. You can see Meister Eckhart and Böhme and all of this entire tradition, Cusanus, this entire pietist and Latin tradition right through his philosophy. But he doesn't leave people like Kant and Leibniz and Fichte behind. These are all sources. There's a kind of smattering of all of these, let's say, influences in Schelling's thought. Like you open up the Freedom Essay, and this is what made me fall in love with it. He's bringing up Kant's Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason, Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, Böhme's Mysterium Magnum, talking about Meister Eckhart. At one point, he calls being, he says that God is the Übersein, beyond being. This is right from Meister Eckhart. So there is this element in Schelling that I think is there that maybe not in the later Hegel, like in his logic, but I do think that there, you could read Glenn Alexander McGee's The Hermetic Hegel, which I highly recommend everyone reading. And you can see this tradition in Hegel as well. It just so happens that later Hegel becomes much more absorbed in Aristotle, and Schelling is much more grounded in Plato, the Neoplatonists, and this theosophical tradition.
Nietzsche was also his family. His father was a Lutheran pastor and came from the Pietist tradition as well. I wasn't really aware of how much theosophy is really involved in the backdrop of Lutheran Pietism, but Hollingdale has theorized that a lot of Nietzsche's his amor fati may spring from pietism because it's a much more, you're not supposed to, in some strands of Christianity, you can almost become sort of, well, anti-worldly. And in pietism, you're not supposed to hate life. That's a sin. It's funny that Nietzsche is so anti-Christian on the basis that he attacks its otherworldism, the fact that it superimposes, it mediates our experience of the immediate phenomenal world, the world of our impulses and everything. It mediates it with these abstract concepts and with this conception of the divine that's sort of beyond our reach. And there's that passage, How the True World Finally Became a Fable, where he sort of charts from Plato to Christianity to Kant to Schopenhauer, how the absolute sort of loses its ability to motivate us because it's become so inaccessible to man. And it's just funny that there's a certain way of reading Nietzsche, in spite of his anti-Christianity, as almost taking that pietist attitude and applying it in a worldly philosophy, we might say. That's very interesting as well, because it seems as though through his mystical inclinations, Schelling would not hold the absolute. He wouldn't hold to that conception that it's inaccessible from us, as we've already sort of described.
Yeah, no, it's really funny. Just as you're getting to the end point in the freedom essay, Schelling talks about this dark ground dissolving. It dissolves, leaving this dark spark or this dark remnant in all of us, which is basically heteronomy in Kant. It's the fact that sometimes we can let our ego take over ourselves. And Schelling thinks that when we do that, we no longer become an individual. We're kind of an object, or we're not being in that sense. But he ends the freedom essay with love. Love is higher than spirit. Love is not an expansive force, not a contractive force, but an attractive force. And we need evil for love to emerge. We need the self-absorbed egotism for not eros, but agape, for true love, love to emerge. And I always find it so funny that the German idealist text ends with love. It's interesting because Schelling's Christianity in the late work is actually kind of anarchistic. He has
Hmm.
this conception where he says the first stage of Christianity is Pauline. It's based on the law of circumcision of the heart with St. Paul. And then later the logos with John, but sorry, with Luke, I think is the second one. But the final element is this Johannine church, this church to come, which is a community without a church. It's a community, a stateless state,
What,
a
what what's
stateless,
what's the meaning behind Johannine? Who's the
like
Johann?
John, the Search of John.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay, okay.
The Church of John, St. John, is this philosophical religion, which Schelling calls later on. Its end goal is for all of us to kind of live in harmony, live in this community without a state, without a currency. It's very anarchistic, which I find very interesting. Although my
Again,
main
in comparison to Hegel, too, the state at the end of history versus the abolition of a state at the end of history.
yes, yes. I'm really sorry if I'm kind of all over the place. I
No,
apologize.
I think this is going to be a great episode. I heard you in another interview say, well, you mentioned earlier you wrote your master's thesis on Deleuze, but I heard you say in another interview that you now really dislike Deleuze. Um, and I was wondering why that is. Maybe if you could compare, I could see from like maybe the outside in, if people are only have like a cursory familiarity with some of these ideas. A lot of what Deleuze puts forward in difference and repetition may seem somewhat similar, actually. How would you compare their metaphysics? Deleuze, of course, says he's a pure metaphysician, which is something that I both love and hate about him, because I like the confidence, the it almost seems atavistic, right, in a certain way, like a throwback, an old style of philosophy. But what do you how do you feel about Deleuze these days? What do you think of his reading of Nietzsche? How would you how has your relationship to his work evolved?
I have this antagonistic relationship with Deleuze And because I mean I called myself a Deleuzean for so long, and it felt really long actually. And my first publication was on Deleuze. My master's thesis was on Deleuze. And I wrote on difference and repetition. And I saw something in Deleuze's philosophy, this brilliant freedom, this brilliant mode of creativity that, after the books on cinema and the late work, and maybe some of the work with Guattari, I mean, to this day, I still say that his book on Kant is brilliant. I think his books on Bergson are very interesting. His book on Francis Bacon, I will forever love that book. So there are things and elements in him that I agree with you. What he hates the most, and I consider Deleuze to be a very charitable reader of many, many people. He states in the beginning of Difference and Repetition that the greatest thing that he hated the most is the dialectic in Hegel. What I think Deleuze means by that is not that he hates Hegel, but he hates French Hegelianism and what it's become. And later on, when he's talking about the dialectic and what it does, and he says that, as we were talking about before, about all determinations are negations, he says that Hegel's negative philosophy is not really difference. He calls it the shadow of difference.
Right.
And he
That's also the parallel I'm kind of seeing though, because it seems like when we were talking about earlier, the similarity between Nietzsche and Schelling is this desire for affirmative philosophy for which seems to be there in Deleuze as well.
what I think maybe when I return to difference repetition, I realize that, you know, and I've been criticized about this, and it's okay. Deleuze finds the problem with philosophy is that the whole argument of the spurious infinite. And he finds a problem with Leibniz's theodicy, and yet writes a book on, writes a
Yeah.
brilliant book on Leibniz. He says he hates the dialectic, but at some points in, it seems like he is creating a dialectic,
Yeah.
oddly. And he also says at the end of Difference and Repetition and in the Logic of Sense that he hates the encyclopedists and yet creates an encyclopedia with Guattari. Let's call it an anti-encyclopedia, but in the sense, so is he doing this meaningfully? Is he doing it on purpose? But these are just things that kind of irked me at first. But really what irked me was at the end of the cinema books, Deleuze has this point where humanity gets to this point where it's too late for Hitler. We all have our inner fascisms,
Mm.
our inner fascists, sorry, and that at the end of the day, we all just want to take the money and run. Has really bothered me. And even some of his comments about philosophy being the creation of concepts, I also thought that was problematic. That philosophy can't just be the creation of concepts that makes everything too conceptual. It makes everything, the immanentization of concepts and not in the world. But then again, he has this great, as Ian Hamilton Grant says, he's got this great philosophy of nature as well too. He talks about, no one talks about he's going to create a philosophy for the world. So I see lots of great things about him, but at the end of the day, I kind of see him as arbitrarily creating concepts. He's this, he says he's more attracted to the forger in the film, in the movie The Forger, who forges these fake artworks than the actual artist. And I kind of saw
Mm.
Deleuze as this forger, not of creative concepts, but of these, forging concepts, bringing them together. And I wasn't sure if that was meant to be arbitrary or if that was just meant to replace dogma, to replace opinion.
Right. It's a familiar thing with philosophers where they define philosophy in such a way that they exemplify the definition because that's what Deleuze loves to do. And I think he did state that he liked to coin neologisms and like create concepts by using words and arguments in unconventional ways in a way to sort of break down the normal familiar thought patterns that we fall into that aren't really thinking, right? That we sort of often have, if we're familiar with reading a bunch of philosophy, we have sort of our set of logical or metaphysical or ethical priors that we bring to the text and that we fit everything into these patterns. And he's sort of trying to disrupt that, which could be a part of a project to create freedom. But I definitely know what you mean that at times he seems like a man at war with himself in that he is, if he wasn't so explicitly anti-dialectical, I would say he's definitely seems like a dialectical thinker. He could easily be grouped that way if he didn't insist so sincerely against it.
I think he creates the perfect weapon, thought as the perfect weapon, in order to attack philosophy. And philosophy that is the philosophy that can harm. So this is a one brilliant thing about him. But another thing is I don't know what to do with it afterwards.
Mm.
Like when I see other podcasts, I have lots of friends that are Deleuzian, and I just don't know what else to do with it. The decentering of the human, I feel much more related to like personalist ontologies, so the ontologies of like people like Edith Stein and Schelling, personhood. So, but then again, there's great things about his philosophy. Like, I think a lot of queer theory has embraced Deleuze, and I think that's wonderful. But I find him odd. There's something about him that just kind of rubs me
It's
the
an
wrong way.
understatement. It's an understatement. Yeah, I think he might even be trying to rub people the wrong way in some sense. I think that would be probably my biggest gripe with Deleuze is maybe a Nietzschean style criticism is that I get the sense that he intends to make himself difficult to read at times. That it's almost like that again, I'm not just saying some people make that claim about the post-structuralist writers like that they're trying to say it's all just a bunch of nonsense or they're including gibberish or something to mystify the text. That's not what I'm saying exactly. Maybe in the same sense that Kierkegaard said that he wanted to make everything more difficult on everyone. Like there can be everyone's been making the problems of life easier. I'm going to be the first one to come along and make things harder. Again, I think there might be something to that, to break up the easy set of concepts that we already have.
You're very right about that because in a vulgar sense, and I mean this vulgarly, okay? I see the entire movement of post-structuralism as like, yellow tape, that police use at a homicide. They trace out the object. Yellow tape goes over the space. And then what the post-structuralist does, or what the philosopher does, is they divide the object, look for the subtle ebbs and flows of power that invented this object, and then at the end of the day, they just leave whatever object is in that area of yellow tape and drawn in chalk on the ground. That's it. And they leave that for us. They disclose why it's there in the first place, what power form, what forms of power raised this object or created this object, and then they just kind of leave it for us. And
Yeah.
so many people get angry when I bring up this example over and over and over again, but I can't help it. This is how I feel that Derrida's doing, this like infinite dance of difference and even with Foucault and others. And I could be totally wrong, and please, send emails to me about why I'm wrong. But that's just what I feel about all of them.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fascinating, Chris. Thank you very much for having this conversation with me. Maybe before we go, could you recommend to readers who are not familiar with the German idealist tradition or with Schelling, where should they get started? What are the texts that you recommend? Obviously, there's the Freedom essay. What would you recommend in that regard? And then also, if you wanted to talk about anything that you're working on or anything you have coming up in the future.
Well, first, again, thank you so much for having me. I used to say the freedom essay, but I actually think that might be a little too much. There's a dialogue by Schelling called Bruno, the Bruno dialogue. It's very Neoplatonist, and we were talking about that today. But I really like it because you get a sense of all of Schelling's philosophy to a certain degree. And in it, there are two characters. There's Bruno, after Giordano Bruno, who is played
Mm,
through the mouthpiece of Schelling. kind of like Socrates and Plato. And
Yeah.
then there's Lucian, who is played by who's meant to be Fichte. And they have this great dialogue about subjective idealism and objective idealism, and they go through their understanding of the absolute and the world and reality. And I think it's a solid place to start for anyone interested in Schelling because the introduction by Michael Vader is amazing and it, gives a great background and it's written in dialogue. It's a dialogical essay or sorry, work, kind of like the Platonic works, and Schelling meant it to seem like a Platonic work.
Mm.
So it's really fascinating. So even yourself, if you want to
Yeah.
dabble into something into Schelling and you already love the Hellenistic tradition or you love the Platonic tradition or Neoplatonists, it's a wonderful text to get into. I have friends that are not into German idealism that like Plato and the Neoplatonists that have read it and said it's brilliant. So it's really, really cool to jump into it. And I think it's a wonderful text. I think that is the best one to get into.
Awesome.
There's also, for those that are interested in like philosophy of religion, there's a small short essay called Philosophy and Religion by Schelling, and it's really, really, it's brilliant. It's again small, maybe 90 pages, and I think that's a great work. The Freedom essay, it's wonderful. You can definitely take a look at that. I've actually written an essay on how to read the Freedom essay, and that's on in Epoche. It's a free philosophy journal. They're wonderful guys that have put this journal together. I've written an essay on how to read the Freedom essay. That maybe,
Awesome. Yeah, we
you
can
don't
put that
have
in the episode description if you'd send those to me.
sure. I mean, you don't have to read my work, but I wrote that for new readers who are
Right. But
interested in the
here's the
Freedom
place
essay.
to plug that.
Yes.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and other than that, I have a chapter coming out for Schelling's 250th anniversary that I'll have, posted soon on the relationship between Jakob Böhme and the Freedom Essay. So Schelling's relation to Theosophy. So if anyone's interested in that, it should be coming out in a month or two, and I can post that for free, the article on my academia account, so people can read it.
Is that the 250th anniversary of his birth coming up?
Yeah, the 250th,
Oh,
sorry, I'm all over the place. The
no, you're good.
250th anniversary of his birth, yes.
Wait, so was he born in 1776? I should have looked that up before.
Oh, no, sorry, he was born in 1775.
Okay, so it's like a celebration of that. Okay, got it.
Yeah, it
Cool.
happened. It happened around December, the big, huge event, and people were, I have written a couple articles for that. But yeah, no, that's I have to tell you something that just off the record here. I haven't read Nietzsche in a really long time. I loved him for one point, but hearing you talk and hearing the passion in your voice, and even in some of the videos that I see of you when you talk about Nietzsche, it's made me want to really go pick up Nietzsche again. So I thank you for that.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, I are you sure that's off the record? I'd I'd love to include
No,
that.
no, no, no,
I
no.
could cut it
Keep
out.
no, no, keep no, 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 no. Keep that in the video.
Okay.
Keep that in for sure. No.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I've very much enjoyed your videos as well recently in the interviews you do because I your focus on idealism, it's an area of philosophy that's always interested me and that I have like peripheral knowledge of, right? Like I'm very much interested in just the German tradition around that time and some of the more maybe underexplored figures like Herder and Hamann and Lessing and Jacobi. But I'm not like it's always been something that I don't talk about on the channel because I don't have a command of it. So I love that we got to do this. I got to talk to you because you're one of my go-tos for learning about that.
Oh, thank
And
you so much. And by the way,
yeah,
Haman and Herder videos are coming up. By the
oh,
summer, they'll
cool.
be up. Yep, yep.
Excellent. I'll definitely look into that. I'm definitely planning, I will talk about Herder eventually. I just need, it's the kind of thing where I need, that'll be a long time coming. I need to read more and delve more into him. But as I've been reading Cassirer's work, I can detect a lot of Herder, and he'll explicitly reference him. But even in
Loves
when he
him.
doesn't explicitly reference him, I'm like, oh, that's Herder. So that's
I think
cool.
you know what you and I are going to be great friends because I love Kassir and I love like I see him as like I love neo-Kantianism and I think he is for me I let me just say this out. I really dislike Heidegger and I really love Kassir and I think Kassir deserves much more recognition,
Well, that's one of
than
those. It's one of those philosophical famous events, right? Where there's kind of this meme that started right after the Davos debate of like Heidegger in modern language. If Twitter was around back then, they would have been saying Cassirer got dragged, like Cassirer took the L to Heidegger. That was the attitude of a lot of people. And I think there are Heideggerians out there and people who like never look into Cassirer because they're like, oh, that's the old, outdated neo-Kantian liberal philosophy that sort of like went the way of the buffalo at the Davos debate. I don't need to look at that at all. The more I learned about Cassirer and the more I learned about that debate too, the less I liked Heidegger and his position, or like the less I sided with him.
yeah, I really dislike that. Oh, he's just a liberal, don't read him. I mean, for me, right now, especially now with the fact that information is everywhere, the philosophy of a philosophy of culture is more important than we can even imagine right now. So I think what he offers us, even Nietzsche as well too. I think it's so important that we can't turn a blind. We don't need to go to Baudrillard to get a philosophy of information. I mean, it's already there in Cassira. So
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. Everyone go read Cassirer and Schelling. Thank you very much, Chris.
thank you so much for everything.
Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.